General Hospital spoilers reveal that Drew's animosity toward Curtis had reached a fever pitch, a simmering resentment that had, over time, become something far darker and more dangerous. What had once been a simple disagreement between two men had morphed into an all-consuming hatred, a driving force that dictated Drew's every move. The catalyst for this deep-seated rage was a betrayal that Curtis had unwittingly or perhaps knowingly committed, an act that Drew could never forgive. The consequences of Curtis' actions were far-reaching, and Drew could no longer turn a blind eye to the damage that had been done. At first, Drew had tried to make sense of the situation. He had attempted to reason with himself, to understand Curtis's motives, but the more he thought about it, the more his anger grew. Curtis had crossed a line. And Drew couldn't help but feel that it was personal. The trust that had once existed between them had been shattered, and Drew was no longer able to view Curtis as an ally. What had begun as a small rift had now turned into a deep wound that Drew couldn't ignore. The emotional toll weighed heavily on him, but the overwhelming need for revenge became his sole focus. His thoughts were consumed by one thing: Curtis needed to pay. What began as a mere frustration had now become an obsession. Drew's anger had festered until it had completely overtaken him. Every waking moment was spent plotting, strategizing, and finding ways to bring Curtis to his knees. Drew had always been calculated, a man who prided himself on making smart, measured decisions. But this time, the logic behind his actions was blurred. There were no rules, no boundaries. All that mattered was making Curtis feel the full weight of Drew's fury. It wasn't just about winning or gaining back what he'd lost, it was about proving that Curtis would regret ever crossing him. Drew's fixation on Curtis began to take on a life of its own. His thoughts were consumed by images of Curtis, of the betrayal, and of how he could make his enemy suffer. His desire for revenge clouded his judgment, and the more Drew obsessed over the plan, the more destructive it became. He had once been a man who valued loyalty above all else, but now he was willing to manipulate and control anyone who stood in his way. The thought of Curtis's downfall became the only thing that kept him going, and Drew's obsession with destroying his former friend led him down a path from which there was no turning back. As the tension between Drew and Curtis grew, it became clear that the stakes had escalated far beyond a simple personal conflict. Drew wasn't just trying to settle a score, he was waging a war. And he intended to win at all costs. His every action, no matter how calculated, was driven by the desire to bring Curtis down. Drew's obsession began to spill over into every area of his life. Relationships that once seemed stable were now fractured, and the friends and allies he had once trusted began to question his motives. But Drew didn't care. He was consumed by one thing: vengeance. His focus was singular, and nothing, not even the destruction of his own life, could deter him. The more Drew pushed, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Curtis anymore. It was about control. It was about proving to himself, and to everyone else, that he was the one in charge. Curtis had humiliated him, taken something from him. And now Drew was determined to make him pay. The deeper Drew became entangled in his quest for revenge, the more he realized just how far he was willing to go. Lines were crossed. And boundaries were pushed further with every decision he made. But as Drew's fixation on Curtis grew, so did the consequences. The more Drew tried to orchestrate his revenge, the more he risked losing everything that had once been important to him. His desire for retribution had become an addiction. And it consumed him to the point where he could no longer distinguish between the need to exact justice and the need to destroy. He was no longer just fighting for his honor or dignity, he was fighting to regain control over a life that had slipped through his fingers. The obsessive nature of his pursuit began to eat away at him, warping his sense of right and wrong, pushing him to make choices he would never have considered before. The stakes were becoming too high. Drew's plan to destroy Curtis was no longer just about Curtis, it was about his own redemption, his own sense of power, and his own ability to regain control. The deeper Drew dug, the more he realized that he might not be able to stop. What had begun as a personal vendetta had spiraled into something far more dangerous. And the consequences of his obsession were becoming more apparent. Those around him, including people he cared about, began to feel the ripple effect of his actions. They could see the change in him. The way his focus had shifted from building something meaningful to tearing down those who had wronged him. The Drew they once knew was no longer the same. As Drew's obsession reached its peak, it became evident that he was no longer in control of the situation. His need to destroy Curtis had taken on a life of its own, and now, it was threatening to destroy Drew as well. His plans had become more reckless, more violent, and the damage he was causing was becoming irreversible. The destruction he had set in motion wasn't just directed at Curtis anymore, it was consuming everyone in his orbit. The question now wasn't whether Drew would succeed in bringing Curtis to his knees, it was whether Drew would survive the aftermath of his own actions. As the situation continued to escalate, Drew found himself standing at the precipice of something far worse than he had anticipated. His obsession had taken him too far, and now he was faced with the reality that the cost of his revenge might be more than he was willing to pay. What had started as a calculated desire for justice had spiraled into madness. And the fallout was already beginning to show. The path Drew had chosen was leading him to a place he might never escape. And the devastation he had caused might be the very thing that destroys him in the end. The war he waged with Curtis was just the beginning. And Drew was about to face the consequences of becoming consumed by his own hatred. Drew had always been a man who operated in the shadows, calculating his every move with precision. But now, his obsession had taken a dark turn. What had once been a personal vendetta had expanded into something far more sinister. Drew, consumed by a need for control and retribution, had set his sights on Porsha and Trina, two women who, until now, had seemed untouchable in his world. Their connection to Kai had given Drew the perfect opportunity to manipulate the situation to his advantage, and he was determined to use it. Drew's approach was insidious. He knew that the key to breaking Porsha and Trina lay in their vulnerabilities. Porsha, with her unshakable confidence and strong moral compass, was a formidable opponent. But Drew had learned enough about her past to know there were cracks in her armor. Trina, too, was someone he had studied carefully, someone with a heart as strong as her mother's. Yet driven by emotion and a need to protect those she loved. Drew saw that as a weakness he could exploit. Using Kai as a pawn in his game of manipulation, Drew had started to weave a web around them. He knew that if he played his cards right, he could slowly chip away at the foundation of their relationship with Kai, ultimately driving a wedge between them. The more Drew pushed, the more he realized that his actions were not just about eliminating his enemies, they were about controlling the narrative of Porsha and Trina's lives. If he could twist their perceptions of Kai, they would turn against him, and Drew could make his move without resistance. But the deeper Drew delved into his plot, the more obsessed he became. What began as a calculated plan to weaken his enemies had turned into something far more destructive. Every conversation with Kai, every seed of doubt planted in his mind, was designed to bring about the chaos Drew craved. He needed them to crumble, to be vulnerable, to feel the weight of their decisions, and most of all, to feel isolated. The darkness of his obsession was all-consuming, and he no longer cared who he hurt in the process. His aim was singular: destruction. The destruction of the women who had once been allies. Of the family ties that had made them strong. As the web of manipulation spread, Drew's plans started to unravel in unexpected ways. He had underestimated the strength of Porsha and Trina's bond. Not realizing that their love for each other, their fierce protectiveness, would become a weapon they would wield against him. The more he pushed, the more they fought back, pushing back with a unity Drew hadn't anticipated. But rather than backing down, Drew became more determined. He believed that he could break them. That their strength was merely an illusion. The more they resisted, the more he doubled down on his tactics, using Kai as a means to sow distrust and insecurity. Drew's obsession had reached a point of madness. He no longer cared about the long-term consequences of his actions. The lines between right and wrong had blurred. And all that mattered was making Porsha and Trina feel the full weight of his wrath. What had started as a personal vendetta had spiraled into an all-consuming obsession. And Drew knew there was no turning back. The plot he had set in motion was now beyond his control, and as it unfolded, He realized just how far he was willing to go to destroy those who had crossed him. As the tension built, Drew found himself trapped in a cycle of obsession and destruction. The more he tried to tear Porsha and Trina apart, the more he realized that his plans were becoming a reflection of his own inner chaos. The destruction he had hoped to unleash on them was starting to consume him as well. The more he manipulated and controlled, the more he lost himself in the process. His hatred for Porsha and Trina had become a drug, and he couldn't stop himself from seeking more, pushing further, until there was nothing left of the man he once was. The consequences of Drew's actions were already beginning to show. Porsha and Trina, though caught in the web of his manipulation, were not as easily broken as Drew had anticipated. Their resilience, their love for each other, was becoming a force that was counteracting his every move. And in his obsession to destroy them, Drew was pushing himself closer to a breaking point. The chaos he had created had begun to spiral out of control, and he was no longer the one pulling the strings. His obsession with Porsha and Trina had clouded his judgment. And now he found himself in a battle not just with them, but with himself. As Drew's plans continued to unfold, the situation grew more unpredictable. The women he had sought to destroy were fighting back with a strength he hadn't anticipated, and his own obsession was turning into a liability. He had underestimated the depth of their bond, the strength of their resistance, and now, his own plans were threatening to implode. What had begun as a calculated strategy to eliminate his enemies was now threatening to consume him entirely. The fallout from his actions would not only affect Porsha and Trina but would reverberate through every part of Drew's life. In the end, Drew realized that his obsession with destroying Porsha and Trina had created a monster far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. What he had hoped would be a controlled explosion had become a catastrophic chain reaction, one that he no longer had the power to stop. His obsession had gone too far, and now, the consequences were undeniable. The madness of his actions had reached its peak. And Drew was faced with the realization that his quest for revenge had ultimately destroyed him more than it had destroyed anyone else. Curtis's world had always been one of calculated risks. But nothing could have prepared him for the devastating loss he was about to endure. The grief of losing two close family members at once had shattered his emotional stability, leaving him in a state of confusion and anger that he could barely understand. Each loss felt like a cruel blow, one that struck deep into his soul and left him feeling vulnerable and exposed in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the days passed, the weight of his grief only grew heavier, consuming him with thoughts of revenge and regret. It wasn't just the loss of loved ones, it was the way it happened, the sense that Curtis had failed to protect them. And now the world around him seemed to be crumbling. This deep sorrow, however, had ignited something within him, a darkness that had been slowly building and was now starting to consume his every thought. The grief Curtis felt morphed into an obsession, one that drove him to seek answers that would never come, to lash out at those he believed had failed him. As he grappled with his pain, Curtis's mind began to fixate on one person, Drew. The tangled web of betrayal, misunderstandings, and resentment between the two men had reached a breaking point, and now, with Curtis in his most vulnerable state, Drew became the target of his rage. Curtis had always known Drew, but their relationship had taken a dark turn in recent years. Drew, whose life had already been marred by a series of tragedies, seemed to be spiraling downward after a disastrous wedding and the weight of unresolved issues from his past. The man Curtis once saw as a brother, an ally, was now a shadow of himself. And Curtis found it hard to reconcile the person Drew had become with the one he once trusted. The recent events, coupled with Drew's erratic behavior, had pushed Curtis to a breaking point. He couldn't just sit back anymore, he needed answers, and he needed revenge. Drew's own struggles, particularly following his disastrous wedding, had plunged him into a world of darkness. The man who had once been a stabilizing force in Curtis's life was now spiraling, and that spiral had only fueled Curtis's anger. Drew's unpredictability made it even harder to determine where the lines between friendship and rivalry lay. The situation between them had shifted from one of mutual respect to a full-blown battle for control, power, and, ultimately, revenge. Drew, no longer the man Curtis once knew, had become a symbol of the darkness Curtis feared he was becoming. Curtis's desire for revenge against Drew turned into an obsession. Curtis's obsession with Drew intensified, and the more he tried to get answers, the more dangerous things became. The emotional fallout from Curtis's losses had already put him on a dangerous path. But now, fueled by vengeance, he was willing to do anything to make Drew pay for the suffering he had caused. The once strong bond between them had fractured. And now they were headed toward a devastating confrontation, one that would destroy whatever remained of their friendship and, quite possibly, the lives of those closest to them. The battle between Curtis and Drew became more than just a feud, it became a war of wills, a contest for survival. Curtis was driven by pain, loss, and a thirst for justice that had warped into something far darker. Drew, on the other hand, was fighting against his own demons, the mistakes of his past weighing heavily on him. Neither man was willing to back down, and as their confrontation escalated, the toll it took on both of them became unbearable. Their struggle was no longer just about settling old scores, it was about personal survival, about the fear that neither could escape the consequences of their past decisions. What had once been a mutual respect and understanding between the two men was now a bitter, destructive rivalry. Drew's obsession with his own failures, combined with Curtis's blind rage, led to a series of decisions that only fueled the chaos between them. Each move they made in the battle against each other seemed to push them both further into darkness. Curtis's once clear sense of purpose was now clouded by his obsession with Drew, and Drew's own self-doubt and guilt made him a dangerous, unpredictable force. The repercussions of their war were far-reaching. The more they clashed, the more their lives, and the lives of those they cared about, spiraled out of control. The tragedy that Curtis had experienced was now only amplified by the destruction he was willing to cause in his quest for vengeance. He was no longer the man he once was, the grief and pain of losing family members had morphed him into someone ruthless and determined to make others feel the same agony he had endured. Drew, for his part, was no better. His descent into darkness following the wedding and his ongoing struggles had turned him into a man willing to destroy anything in his path to escape his own internal chaos. In the end, the clash between Curtis and Drew was inevitable. Their paths had crossed too many times, and each had become a reflection of the other's flaws and failures. What had begun as a personal conflict between two men who once considered each other family had turned into a catastrophic battle for control, power, and survival. The fallout from their actions was devastating, and neither Curtis nor Drew could escape the consequences of their choices. The war they waged would leave scars, not only on them but on everyone around them. The darkness that had consumed them both now threatened to destroy everything they had once held dear. And the result of their battle was a disaster neither could avoid. The obsession with revenge, with control, and with the ghosts of their pasts had ultimately led them to the edge of oblivion. And as they stood at the precipice, it was clear that neither man could escape the destruction they had brought upon themselves. What had started as a quest for justice had spiraled into a nightmare. And the damage they had caused was irreversible. The conflict between Drew and Curtis had reached a breaking point, one that neither man could have anticipated. Drew's obsession with revenge and his desire to prove himself had led him down a dark and dangerous path, and now, it seemed like his fate was sealed. Curtis, driven by his own grief and a thirst for justice, had been pushed to the brink. The rivalry between the two had become more than just a personal vendetta, it had become a war. And one where the stakes were higher than either of them had realized. The emotional toll had been devastating, and as Drew and Curtis clashed, the consequences were impossible to ignore. For Drew, the fight with Curtis had become a matter of survival. He had always prided himself on his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies, but in this battle, he had underestimated Curtis. What started as a simple disagreement had morphed into a life-or-death struggle, and Drew found himself unable to keep up with the intensity of Curtis's determination. The darkness that had consumed Drew, his obsession with proving himself and taking down those who had wronged him, had clouded his judgment. He no longer saw the danger Curtis posed. He only saw an enemy to defeat. But Curtis, driven by his own emotions and the recent losses he had suffered, was no longer just an ally turned adversary, he had become a force of nature. one that Drew could not defeat. Curtis's calculated moves, his relentless pursuit of Drew, left no room for mercy. The pain that had once been buried deep within him was now driving every decision he made, and he was determined to make Drew pay for the suffering he had caused. Curtis had nothing left to lose. The stakes had never been higher for him, and as Drew found himself cornered by Curtis's growing power and ruthless resolve, he began to realize just how wrong he had been. Drew had been playing a dangerous game, thinking he could control the situation, thinking that his own ambitions could somehow make him the victor. But now, as Curtis closed in on him, Drew realized that the tables had turned. The moment of reckoning came swiftly. Drew, once a man in control, found himself overwhelmed and defeated by Curtis's unrelenting assault. It was no longer about the past betrayals or the wounds they had inflicted on each other. It was about Curtis's need for justice, and Drew's inability to escape the consequences of his actions. Curtis had seen too much destruction, too much pain, to allow Drew to continue his dangerous path. The culmination of their rivalry was not a battle of equals, but rather the inevitable result of Drew's obsessive pursuit of control and revenge. The power had shifted, and now Curtis was the one in charge. In the end, it was Curtis who emerged victorious. And Drew, the man who once thought himself untouchable, was brought to his knees. It was a catastrophe, a moment of undeniable destruction that signified the end of Drew's reign. Curtis, in his own grief-fueled vengeance, had finally done what Drew had never anticipated. He had destroyed him. But what was even more devastating was the realization that the battle for power had cost them both everything. Curtis had won, but the victory was hollow. What had been gained through bloodshed and hatred would never bring back what they had lost, and the repercussions of this war would reverberate far beyond the two men. Drew's defeat marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where the consequences of their actions could no longer be ignored. The emotional fallout from this battle would be felt for years to come. Curtis had triumphed, but the damage was already done, and nothing could erase the scars of their rivalry. What had started as a personal conflict had spiraled into a full-scale disaster. And now both men were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. Curtis had destroyed Drew, but in doing so, he had lost a part of himself as well. The chaos they had unleashed had no simple resolution, and the world around them would never be the same again.